Hello, welcome to excuse me, Pirkei Avot History and Ashkafa, and we took a one-week break from last week, for which I apologize, but it was unavoidable. And we are back, sponsored by the Tel Aviv International Synagogue under the inspired leadership of Rabbi Ariel Constantine. It's funny, as it turns out, the Mishnah that we're about to embark upon studying speaks directly to a class that I gave actually turns out a number of times over Shavuot, and I'm actually grateful for the opportunity to share it in English to a broader audience. I think not just because I already have it ready, but because I think it speaks to a critical issue in the contemporary development of Orthodox Judaism, and I think in general to the proper approach and understanding of the what's called in Hebrew the Aronos Sfarim HaYehudi, the Jewish library. So let's dig in and we'll see what that to which I'm referring. Except I've got my glasses, excuse me. We are in the third chapter, and in the ninth Mishnah, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa Amar. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa used to say, "Kol shirat cheto kodemet l'chochmato, chochmato mitkayemet." Anyone whose fear of heaven takes precedence or precedes, either chronologically or conceptually, his wisdom, chochmato mitkayemet, his wisdom will be sustained. V'kol shechachmato kodemet lirat cheto, and anyone whose wisdom precedes or takes priority to his fear of heaven, or to his fear of sin, rather, en chochmato mitkayemet, his wisdom will not be sustained. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa was an interesting person. He lived in the 2nd century, in the era after the destruction of the temple. He was known as something of a mystic, not just something of a mystic, he was a mystic. Apparently a well-known mystic, a person at the same time who had something of a career of a wonder worker. There were two stories in the Talmud that are very indicative of the fact that he was consulted by the leading rabbis of his time, asking for his prayers in order to save or pray for a cure for their children. The two people the two figures involved. One was Rabbi Gamliel II, who was the head of the Sanhedrin in Yavne in the generation and a half after the destruction of the temple, and before that, the person who actually saved Torah in the generation after the destruction of Yochanan ben Zakkai. So he's he's an interesting person, and he warrants a closer study, but that's all I can give you right now, because we're going to concentrate on his words. What Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa seems to be saying, fear of sin is not just a question of doing the wrong thing. The act of sin, or the act of error, whether it's on purpose or whether it's by accident, constitutes, again, actively or passively, an act of rebellion against God. It's one of the reasons why, and I think we mentioned this earlier, that when the Mishnah says that one should be careful about what are apparently less important or less heavy or less portentous mitzvot, and less important or apparently less portentous sins, one should not start making all kinds of calculations. Well, this isn't so important. This is biblical. This is rabbinic. Because at the end of the day, the authority that stands behind the mitzvot, according to Judaism, is in fact God's will, directly or indirectly, directly through the Bible or indirectly through the interpretations, authorized interpretations of the sages. That being the case, when one actually commits an infraction, one is in effect violating God's will. And what does it matter whether the act itself bears a heavier or more severe punishment or more severe consequences or not? In principle, they're the same. So in other words, fear of sin is really a matter of fear of heaven. It's a matter of accepting God's, it's accepting God's will, accepting Kabbalat ol Mitzvot, accepting the authority of the commandments, and accepting the authority of the kingdom of heaven. Now, that must be the Grundnorm, that must be the foundation in which, he says, Torah study or wisdom, which is to which he's referring, and there may be a sort of a bit of a jab in there against people who study outside wisdoms, perhaps, by sort of equating Chokhmah with Torah. It's interesting, the use of the word Chokhmah, I'll just mention this in passing, the use of the word Chokhmah by Maimonides, for example, is consistent in an effort to expand the definition of Torah. In other words, when Maimonides assumed that general wisdom, philosophy, science, math, and so on, are an integral part of Torah, but in a broader sense, is broader defined. Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal, he said it to me, he said it on all kinds of occasions, used to talk about Torah in the broadest sense of the term, and here he was echoing what Maimonides himself used to say when he would say Torah v'chokhmah, or just chokhmah, meaning Torah, including not just Chumash and Gemara and stuff like that, but also, as I say, math and science, which he thought was an integral part of the Torah, and a person cannot be a Talmid Chacham without that. I have recently come to understand that from some very unpleasant interactions that I had in Twitter in the past 24 hours, that this issue of secular studies in the Haredi yeshivot in the United States, it's an issue here too, has become is very, very intense in the past few days. I personally never understood the problem, because you can't make a hide nor hair of the Gemara without math. So it's far from it. In any case, that's not the issue here. So, in other words, when Torah study and when acquisition of wisdom has to be rooted in fear of sin, or basically fear of heaven, Yirat Shamayim. Now, what does that mean? What does Yirat Shamayim mean? So here, I think we would do well if we were to go back and take a look at a poem that everybody knows and nobody really pays attention to. The poem everybody knows and nobody pays attention to is Dayenu, which we all sing at the Seder. Everybody sings Dayenu at the Seder, whatever the case may be. I don't care what kind of Seder it is. That's the song everybody knows, because they all sing Dayenu. The chorus is very easy to understand, or to sing, or to pronounce. But one of the, and we don't pay attention to it, even the more learned of us among us, because it's towards the end of the Seder part itself, and yeah, you want to start eating already, you're hungry, you've been going on, if you took your Seder seriously, you've been at it, learning the Haggadah for at least 2 hours, and even if you didn't take it seriously, it takes about an hour to run through all the paragraphs. So it's time to, as an uncle of mine used to always say, it's time to eat. But that's unfortunate, because Dayenu has a very interesting progression, because it says if God hadn't done this and not done that, then that would have been enough. So it begs the question: okay, what is it about each stage which would have been sufficient to really be say enough? We don't need more than that. The one line which always blew me away, and which I've given a lot of thought to over the past number of years, is the line, Ilu kervanu lifnei har Sinai, v'lo natan lanu et Torah. If he had brought us close to Sinai and had not given us the Torah. Can you imagine? I mean, think about. I recently rewatched the 1956 film The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, and Ann Baxter, and Sir Cedric Hardwicke, and whoever else, E.G. Robinson. And the whole thrust of the movie is that God is going to bring the Israelites to Mount Sinai to give them the law. That's the point. The point of the whole movie. Okay? Can you imagine what would have happened if Moses he takes the Jews out of Egypt, he brings them to Mount Sinai, and then Moses says, "Okay, that's it. Care about there, Sinai, no Torah. Bye." What? This is why you took us out, just to be here in the middle of the desert, to be Kirbetel Nehar Sinai? What is the story here? So the point, and what does it mean? We brought us close to Sinai. So it's very clear, and my remarks are much longer, but it's very clear that what the poet means. He means what happened at Sinai before a word was uttered by God. What occurred was an unmediated, intimate, scary encounter with God. An envelopment in the presence of the Creator of the universe. And that's what that line means. In other words, a person who is a believer, a person for whom God and the presence of God and the hand of God are an active factor in their lives, such a person will be perfectly happy with just staying at Sinai. If all you had done is to bring us close to you and to let us experience your presence in an unmediated and immediate fashion, that would have been enough. What the Torah did, what giving the Torah did, was to give the tools to be able to go out in the world and build the world according to God's will. Now that's something else, because as opposed to, say, Christianity, Judaism, while we does believe in an afterlife, all the action is here. Everything men and women are expected to do is here. That being the case, you need the Torah to be able to, I don't like the use of the term today, but the Taken Olam b'Malchut Shakai, to build the world or to correct the world in the kingdom of heaven. That's the job. It's the reason interesting. There's an interesting halacha that's mentioned in the Talmud, that a person who goes to the cemetery, if he wears his fringes, tzitzis, out of his pants or out of his clothing, should hide them, because it's not nice. Because the poor dead people, they can't do mitzvot anymore. So even though they're in the next world, hopefully, they're in a definitely subordinate and inferior position. So fine, good. But there's more to it than that. I believe that and I can prove it. As I hope to be able to show you in the next few minutes, that the function of the unmediated encounter with God and its connection with giving the Torah is causative. In other words, I'm talking too fast because too fancy because I just came from an academic conference where the point is, of course, to always speak on a higher level than anybody, to speak in a way so abstruse that nobody else understands. The giving of the Torah was an act of revelation and an act of intimacy. In other words, the giving of the Torah goes together with an encounter with God. Now that sets up for all time and defines for all time the nature of Torah study. When one studies Torah, one is supposed to not only intellectually study, analyze, try to understand, but one is supposed to at the same time encounter God. It is not just an act of intellection, an act of education, which of course it is, but it is also an act of worship. How do I know? I know because Maimonides tells me so. Maimonides mentions the commandment to study Torah twice when he enumerates the commandments in his Sefer HaMitzvot, his Book of Commandments. Once he says this is a commandment to study Torah. Okay, that's not any kind of innovative statement. More interestingly, and this is something that Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal always used to point out, that in the fifth positive commandment, when Maimonides describes or discusses the commandment to worship God, he says that the mitzvah of worship of God has two sides to it. The one of which we are most aware is prayer. But that's only part of the story. The other part is study. Study of Torah is an act of worship. If you wish to see it as a dialogue, the prayer being what I have to say to God, and Torah study being what God has to say to me, that's fine. But it is an encounter with God, it is an act of worship. So that when you open a book, a sacred book, whatever it is, and anybody says that the only way to do it is studying Talmud, doesn't know what they're talking about, encounters God. And by the way, that is the reason, that was one of the fundamental justifications, or arguments on justifications, as if he had to go into some kind of, to justify what he thought. Rav Soloveitchik, when he gave Foursquare, when he instituted equal Talmud education for women at Maimonides School in Boston, already in the late 30s, and then stood Foursquare behind the creation of the Stern College Beit Midrash, Stern College for Women, in the mid-70s, made it very, very clear that his action was nowise revolutionary from a conceptual point of view. That yes, it may well be true. It may well be true that from a technical point of view, women are exempt from the commandment to study Torah the way that men are. That's only part of the story. Women are equally obliged. Women are equally obliged to study Torah in order to encounter God to the deepest, most profound, and most all-encompassing manner, just as they are obliged in the mitzvah of prayer. In that regard, there should be no restrictions on what they study either. Again, because the act of study, the act of Talmud Torah, is an act of revelation. And it's striking, however, that this dimension of the commandment to study Torah is actually one of the most neglected and the most endangered. And this has been apparent from the time of the Chumash itself, from the time of the Torah itself. I'll give you an example of someone who said this, and it's worth keeping in mind. In the 1230s, in northern France, Provence, and even in northern Spain, there was a rabbi whose name was Rabbi Moses ben Jacob of Coucy. Coucy is a town northwest of Paris. He was one of the leading scholars of his day, who not only was a legist and a commentator on the Talmud, he was a person who had something of a revivalist character, and he apparently spoke very well. So he liked to wander around and to give inspiring sermons. He was scholar in residence, if you will, throughout, as I said, France and northern Spain. And he took his drashot together and he sort of put them aside. And one of the things that he spoke about very often, and we even have prayers that he wrote in this direction, that people have to develop their God awareness. He didn't think much to do much with the book. He sort of like, or his sermons. But later on, in 1240, he was subpoenaed by the church, by the King of France actually, to testify on behalf of the Talmud, which had been put on trial for blasphemy, with an eye to destroying it and burning it, so that the Jews would have nothing to study, and therefore they would become Christians. That was sort of the logic. And he never testified, but as a result of the trial, the Talmud was convicted. Big surprise. And in 1242, 24 cartloads of precious manuscripts were burned in the Place de Grève on the right bank of the Seine. As a result, because the Talmud had been condemned and burned, and it was illegal to have copies of the Talmud, Jews really needed books to study Torah, and certainly halacha. So Rabbi Moses of Kusi took it upon himself to try to provide a substitute volume which could serve the same purpose in the interim. So what he did was he took Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, he restructured it, he added sources from the Talmud, and added actually the Ashkenazic opinions on dozens and hundreds and thousands of things. So therefore you had some kind of framework within which to study. But it also he peppered it with all kinds of inspirational comments. So not a small business, and he finished it. He was about to finish it in 1247, so it took him a good 7 years, or at least 5 years, to finish. He describes in the introduction, and then later on in the book, that as he was about to publish the book, he had a dream. I don't know, a dream or a nightmare. That a voice came to him and said, "You missed the point. You missed the most important thing." He says, "What did I forget?" He says, "You missed the point. You missed the fact that there is a prohibition against forgetting God." He woke up in the morning in a sweat, apparently. Well, I'm getting dramatic, but he woke up in the morning in a sweat, and he said, "Wow, that's true." Now, what does that mean? So he says, "I see it's a ikar gadol bemunah. It's an important thing." What is he talking about? What he's talking about is the fact that he had filled this book with law, and more law, but he'd neglected the fact that the Torah is supposed to be studied and fulfilled and observed in a self-developed ambiance of God awareness, of Yirat Shamayim, of fear of heaven, love of heaven. That being ensconced, that being enveloped, is what makes the Torah sacred. It's what makes the act of Torah study worship. It's what gives charisma and gives power and gives force to the act of Torah study and to the act of observing the mitzvot. Without it, the Torah becomes an intellectual text, which encourages distance, judgmentalism, cynicism, and all kinds of other isms. Now, it's interesting that in the 13th century, which is the Age of Belief, in fact, somewhere I have here a book called The Age of Belief, which is about medieval Christian theology, that was a concern. Because, look, it's normal. You go out, you got to make a living, you got to take care of your kids, you got all kinds of stuff you got to do. You can forget. So therefore, the Torah prohibits, it says at the very least, you have to work on yourself to be sensitive and have at least a passive awareness as you go through the day of the presence of God. Now, that being so, we have a problem in contemporary society where we're not interacting with other societies that are believer, that are fideist, but a secular which holds belief in contempt, which arrogantly judge God and judge the Torah, and which often turns the study of Jewish heritage into an intellectual act, act we can, accept or deny. Interestingly, that is the reason why a Beit Midrash, which is generally where Torah study, which is classically Torah study, also has an ark, an Aron Kodesh, because you study and teach in the same place. Strikingly, a long time ago, there is an institution in Jerusalem which is known as an Institute for Jewish Studies, ostensibly with some kind of religious affiliation. But when they built their place of study, they made a point of not putting in Aron Kodesh there, because prayer has nothing to do with this. But basically what that was saying was Torah is a text. We're studying Torah like, I don't know, it's ours, okay, Seder. But, you could study Shakespeare, you could study, I have nothing against Shakespeare. You could study Shakespeare, you could study Virgil, you could study Dante, you could study Boccaccio, you could study, Mark Twain. Because it's intellectual exercise. All right, it's mine. Okay, it's mine. You could study Chernyakhovsky. That's mine too. As problematic as Chernyakhovsky was. The combination of Yirat Shamayim with Chokhmah is exactly what is being denied there, and which Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa is demanding. So let's go back to the Mishnah. There's a lot more to what to say here, but I'm not going to go into it now because we're running up against time. Kol shirat chet'o kodemet lechokhmato. If your wisdom is rooted, is preceded by and enveloped by fear of sin and fear of heaven, then your chokhmah, your Torah, will survive. If it's not, then it becomes like any other intellectual endeavor, which you can take or you could leave, and certainly is vulnerable to abandonment upon the entry into the story of competing forms of wisdom and competing value systems and so on, and competition for your time. Reverence, belief, spirituality are essential elements of Torah study. Otherwise, it's Jewish studies, which is like any other intellectual endeavor. No better and no worse. It is against that Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa is inveighing. It is for the other vision that he is importuning. And in a word, as there's sort of something of an interesting common phrase among modern Orthodox yeshiva and Ulpana graduates on this issue. How do you whether a topic of study would be worthy of saying Birkat Torah on it? What does that mean? I'm not going to go into the whole business, but in other words, the difference between one of the reasons why this is based on a Talmudic statement in Bava Metzia, and there's a long discussion by Rabbi Nissim Cherona in the Durham on the same issue, that the fact that Torah study is predicated by a bracha as opposed to anything else, there's no bracha on Chachma, there's a bracha on Torah study, bracha in the sense of secular studies. The difference is that by saying a bracha you transform or define your action as an act not only of intellectual but also of spiritual worth, and creates a different type of dynamic than one would have without it. The minute the bracha is taken away, then you've basically secularized and attenuated the act of Torah study, an act against which Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa warns, and to which our generation is unfortunately extraordinarily vulnerable. Okay, that is it for today. We will meet Mirz Hashem next week, and as usual, please feel free to share this video. It'll be up on my YouTube page. I'll put it up on my Facebook page. And if you have questions, always feel free to ask on Facebook, on the YouTube channel. Make comments. I keep the comments open, and we will see you next time.